Well, as we've been following Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes, we've already seen that he started off so well. And yet, once he'd taken his eyes off the Lord, he ends up taking the huge resource that God has given him and using that, not in serving God, but in actually serving himself, seeking personal meaning and significance and fulfillment, but trying to do it without God being in the picture. Now, it sounds absolutely shocking when you put it out like that, but actually, I think it's a mistake that a lot of Christians make. That we take all the resources that God has given us, all the gifts that He has given us, but we actually, in real terms, end up trying to forge a life of meaning and purpose and significance that doesn't really have God in the picture. That in one sense is indistinguishable from the lives that so many other people live and the way in which they seek to find meaning and purpose and significance. And it's a mistake that is, well, there's nothing new under the sun. It's a mistake that we see Solomon making thousands of years ago. And as he does it, he discovers that there's this restlessness in his soul. Now, again, we've seen that should have driven him back to the Lord, but actually what it does is it drives him to look for the answer to the questions of meaning and significance and purpose and fulfillment almost anywhere else apart from God. It's like he's got to exhaust every other option before he's finally going to realize that it is only in his relationship with God that he will find what he is searching for so desperately. Now, the first place that he looks is pleasure. This passage that we have in front of us this evening at the start of Ecclesiastes 2 actually covers decades of Solomon's life. It was literally the way he lived for most of his earthly pilgrimage. He absolutely pushed this to the limits. He enjoyed everything that the world has to offer. Laughter, wine, sex, successful business ventures, wealth creation, cultural development, beauty, music, building projects, power, status, anything that he found enjoyment in, he pursued to the absolute limits, which he was able to do uniquely because he had the financial, the intellectual resources to do it here, and he was in a position of unassailable power. No one could oppose him or his desires. Now, most of us, I think, believe that we could find meaning and significance in pleasure. You know, we have this deep sense that if only I could be left alone to do the things that I enjoy, then I would be a much happier person. I'd be a much more fulfilled person than I am. If only I could do everything I wanted, if only I could have everything I wanted, then I would be happy. Then I would be at peace. Well, Solomon does get everything he wanted. He did do everything he wanted. How does he put it in the passage before us now? He said, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused myself no pleasure. And yet, in spite of all his achievements, he was still restless, still unfulfilled, still his life was meaningless. But it's not just that. Notice how distorted he becomes in the process. Right? He'd been given these immense resources to serve his kingdom, to serve the people over whom he ruled, to point people to Christ. But when Solomon loses sight of God, you see how his life becomes horrifically self-obsessed, becomes totally self-centered, and actually utterly abusive. Suddenly, everything and everyone simply becomes a means to the end of Solomon's own self-satisfaction. I mean, just notice the way he exploits other people. You pick up the references to slavery, to his harem, to the oppression of his people. Even the things that he achieved that maybe he could have been proud of actually are critically undermined by the fact that it's all driven by no higher purpose than Solomon's own selfish pursuit of significance in a life without God. It's terrifying to watch. And at the end of it all, he still has no rest for his soul. But he almost convinced himself that he'd done it. He discovered that there is some pleasure in hedonism. Verse 10, my heart took delight in all my labor. He took delight in so much of what he did and what he achieved. The problem is it was fleeting. It was superficial, momentary. But the only way Solomon's life could have been even more tragic than it was would have been if he had settled for that. If he persuaded himself that that fleeting pleasure, that superficial, momentary delight was as good as it got. For decades, he could convince himself of that. He could cover over the emptiness. But now, standing on the edge of an eternity that he has spent his life ignoring, now the weight of reality weighs down on him. And it shatters the illusions that he has allowed himself to live with for so many years. Now, as standing on the edge of his grave, it turns out that, looking back, the delight that he had felt actually was a mirage. It wasn't enough to satisfy his longing for meaning and purpose. And so his own final analysis is an admission. When I surveyed all that my hands had done, what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. What a waste of a life. Back in the 5th century, a North African bishop called Augustine wrote a prayer that has become very, very famous in the life of the church. He said, praying to the Lord, he said, you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. That's the lesson Solomon didn't learn until the winter of his life. And it's a lesson that so many of us have still to learn as well. And we must learn it because this is the heart, the foundation of all true spirituality.